The rain fell in sheets, a cold, indifferent curtain washing the color from the world. It hammered against the asphalt of the lonely highway and slicked the windows of the only building illuminated for miles, a low-slung structure with a neon sign that flickered a defiant, buzzing red. The Iron Anvil. Inside, the world was warm, smelling of worn leather, stale beer, and the faint, metallic tang of old engines. Laughter, rough and low, rumbled over the jukebox, wailing a forgotten rock anthem. It was a sanctuary for the men who wore their allegiance on their backs, the snarling wolf's head of the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club. They were a brotherhood forged in miles and hardened by loyalty, men who understood the world through the vibration of a V-twin engine and the unwritten laws of the road. The heavy oak door flew open with a crash that silenced the music, the laughter, and the clinking of glasses. A gust of wind and rain swept into the room, carrying with it a figure so slight she seemed almost a ghost. She stood there, drenched and trembling, her face pale as bone china, her dark hair plastered to her skull. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her eyes, wide with a terror so profound it stole her breath, scanned the room, darting from one bearded, leather-clad man to another. Every man in the bar turned, their expressions shifting from surprise to guarded curiosity. They were not accustomed to uninvited guests, especially not one who looked like she had just outrun death itself. She was a stark contrast to the hardened environment she had invaded. Her thin jacket offered no protection from the storm, and her jeans were soaked through. She hugged herself, not for warmth, but as if trying to hold her own splintering frame together. For a moment she was frozen, a deer caught in the glare of a dozen headlights. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. You could have heard a pin drop on the scarred wooden floor. What does it take for a person to run into the one place society tells you to avoid? What level of desperation pushes you past the stories, the warnings, the ingrained fear of men like these? Her gaze finally landed on the man sitting at the head of the long central table. He was broader than the rest, his presence filling the space around him. A thick, graying beard framed a face carved from granite, and his eyes, clear and steady, held no judgment, only a watchful calm. This was Stone, the president of the Iron Saints. He didn't move, didn't speak, simply held her gaze, offering a silent, solid anchor in her storm of panic. Her lips trembled and she took a faltering step forward. Then another. Her voice, when it finally came, was a raw, broken whisper that barely carried across the room, yet every man heard it as if she had screamed. "Please," she gasped, her breath catching on a sob. "You have to help me." A few men shifted, their hands instinctively moving closer to their vests, a gesture of readiness. Stone raised a single subtle hand, and the movement ceased. He remained perfectly still, his focus entirely on the young woman. "Help you with what?" His voice was a low gravel, steady and calm, cutting through her panic. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the rain. She took another shaky step, her hands now clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. She was fighting for control, forcing the words out past the lump of terror in her throat. The story was there, right behind her eyes, a horror film playing on a loop. "My brother," she finally choked out, the words tearing from her. "He has my little brother. He locked him in the cellar. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure no one ever found him." The air in the room grew colder, the jovial warmth of moments before completely extinguished. The men of the Iron Saints were many things, rough, intimidating, outsiders, but there was a code, a line that was never crossed. It was the bedrock of their brotherhood, the single absolute truth they all lived by. You do not harm a child, ever. "Who has him?" Stone asked, his voice losing none of its calm but gaining a hard, dangerous edge. The young woman, whose name was Maya, shook her head, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. You'll think I'm crazy. No one believes me. He's respected. Everyone likes him." She looked around the room at the unyielding faces, the leather cuts, the tattoos that snaked up arms and necks. She had run here on pure instinct, a last desperate gamble. Now, in the sudden quiet, doubt began to creep in. Had she made a terrible mistake? "We're not everyone," Stone said, his voice dropping lower still. "We're the men you came to. Now tell us his name." She swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on his. In his eyes, she didn't see the judgment she feared. She saw something else, something she hadn't seen in a very long time. A promise. "His name is Martin Sterling," she whispered. "He's our foster father." And with that name, a key turned in a lock, and a chain of events was set into motion that would shake a quiet town to its very foundations, proving that sometimes the only people who can fight the monsters hiding in plain sight are the ones society has already labeled as monsters themselves. The rain continued to beat against the windows of the iron anvil, but inside, a different kind of storm was just beginning to gather. The world had shrunk for Maya and her 8-year-old brother Leo 6 months ago. It had collapsed on a Tuesday afternoon, on a stretch of sun-drenched highway where the scent of hot asphalt and pine needles filled the air. One moment their mother was singing along to the radio, her voice slightly off-key but full of warmth, and their father was laughing from the driver's seat. The next, there was the screech of tires, the horrific crunch of metal, and then a profound, ringing silence. Maya had woken up in a hospital bed with a broken arm and a fractured heart. Leo, physically unharmed but shrouded in a silence as deep and vast as the ocean, had been sitting in a chair by her side. They were orphans. The words felt foreign, like a costume they were being forced to wear. Their first stop was a distant aunt's cramped apartment, a place that smelled of mothballs and regret. She was a woman ill-equipped for sudden motherhood, her patience as thin as the walls of her building. Maya, barely an adult herself, took on the role of parent. She made sure Leo ate, that his homework was done, that he was shielded from the heavy sighs and resentful glances of their temporary guardian. But Leo had retreated into himself. He stopped speaking, communicating only through his drawings, stark, black-and-white sketches of cars, trees, and 2 small figures holding hands, their faces blank. He was a ghost in their new life, and Maya was his only tether to the world. After 2 months, their aunt declared she couldn't cope. Social services were called, and a kind but overworked woman named Sarah Jenkins entered their lives. Sarah saw 2 traumatized children and a system stretched to its breaking point. She searched for a placement, a stable home that could handle a grieving 19-year-old and her selectively mute younger brother. That's when she found the file for Mr. Martin Sterling. On paper, he was perfect, a widower, a respected member of the community, a retired elementary school principal with a large, beautiful home on the edge of town. His application spoke of a desire to give back, to provide a safe haven for children in need. He had glowing references. He passed every background check with flying colors. He was, by all accounts, a pillar of the community. When Maya and Leo first met him, Sterling was all smiles and gentle reassurances. He knelt to speak to Leo, complimenting his sketchbook. He spoke to Maya with a paternal warmth that felt, for a fleeting moment, like a lifeline. "This will be your home," he had said, his voice smooth as honey. "You'll be safe here." The house was immaculate, a sprawling 2-story colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn and a pristine white picket fence. It was the kind of house you saw in magazines, a picture of domestic tranquility, but a picture can hide a multitude of sins. The perfection was a veneer, a carefully constructed facade. The first few weeks were deceptively calm. Sterling was attentive, buying them new clothes and books, but soon the rules began. They were small at first. No shoes in the house. Dishes must be washed and dried immediately after use. Toys must be put away the instant they were no longer being played with. Then the rules grew more specific, more controlling. Maya was not to have friends over. Her phone calls were monitored. He would check her laptop history, questioning her about every website she visited. He framed it all as concern for their well-being. "The world is a dangerous place," he would say, his smile never quite reaching his cold, watchful eyes. "I just want to keep you safe." For Leo, the rules were different. Sterling seemed fixated on his silence. He saw it not as a symptom of trauma, but as an act of defiance. He would try to force Leo to speak, holding a favorite toy just out of reach. "Just say, please, Leo," he'd coax, his voice hardening with each passing second of silence. "It's a simple word." When Leo remained mute, Sterling's mask would slip. The smile would vanish, replaced by a flash of irritation, a tightening of the jaw. The toy would be put away on a high shelf. "Stubbornness will not be rewarded in this house," he would state, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Maya saw it all. She saw the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the way his eyes would linger on Leo with a chilling intensity. She tried to talk to Sarah, the social worker, during a scheduled visit. She mentioned the strict rules, the feeling of being watched. Sterling, who was present for the entire conversation, simply laughed it off. "She's a teenager, Sarah," he said, patting Maya's shoulder in a gesture that felt more like a clamp. "Pushing boundaries is what they do, and poor Leo, the trauma has been so hard on him. We're working on it, day by day." Sarah, faced with a revered community member and a teenager she knew was grieving, saw what Sterling wanted her to see: a man doing his best in a difficult situation. Maya's concerns were noted as adjustment issues. The system had failed them, insulated by the very respectability it was supposed to scrutinize. The isolation was Sterling's most potent weapon. He slowly, methodically, cut them off from the world. He told Maya the local library was insufficient and provided books for her at home. He claimed the park was unsafe and encouraged Leo to play in the backyard, a space enclosed by a tall wooden fence. The beautiful house began to feel like a prison, its polished floors reflecting their trapped faces. Leo's drawings began to change. The blank-faced figures were now inside a box. The lines grew darker, more frantic. He started drawing doors with heavy locks and windows with bars. The night Maya ran, the terror had finally boiled over. Sterling had been trying to make Leo recite the alphabet. Leo, frozen with fear, could not make a sound. Sterling's patience snapped. Maya watched helpless as he grabbed Leo by the arm and dragged him towards the basement door. "Perhaps a little time alone in the dark will help you find your voice," he'd snarled, his face a mask of fury. The door had slammed shut, and the heavy bolt had slid into place. Maya had screamed, had beaten on the door, but Sterling had simply turned to her, his eyes like chips of ice. "One word of this to anyone, Maya," he'd said, his voice a low, venomous hiss, "and you will never see him again. I will tell them you're unstable. I will tell them you hurt him. Who do you think they will believe? Me or a troubled orphan girl?" For an hour she had sat outside the cellar door, listening to Leo's muffled sobs. Panic gave way to a cold, clear certainty. Sterling was right. No one would believe her, not the police, not Sarah. They would see a hysterical girl and a respectable man. She needed someone who wouldn't care about respectability. She needed people who lived outside the system that had so thoroughly betrayed her. She thought of the stories she'd heard in town, the whispers about the bikers who kept to themselves out on the old highway. They were dismissed as dangerous, as outlaws. And in that moment, dangerous was exactly what she needed. As Sterling left the house for one of his regular evening meetings, Maya had slipped out the back door and run. She ran without stopping, fueled by adrenaline and a single desperate prayer, her brother's name a frantic drumbeat in her heart, leading her straight to the flickering red sign of the Iron Anvil. The Iron Saints Motorcycle Club was not a gang of weekend warriors. They were a brotherhood, bound by a code stricter than any law written in a book. Their clubhouse, the Iron Anvil, was more than a bar. It was a fortress, a church, a home. The world saw them as outcasts, a menace clad in leather and chrome. But within these walls there was a discipline and order that would surprise any outsider. The club's finances were managed with meticulous care. Their charity events, like the annual toy run for the local children's hospital, were planned with military precision. Their loyalty to one another was absolute. At the center of this world was Stone. His real name was John Miller, but no one had called him that in 20 years. He had served 2 tours as a Marine Force reconnaissance team leader, and the quiet authority he carried was earned in places most people only see in nightmares. He had seen the worst of humanity, seen how easily the innocent could be crushed under the heel of unchecked power. After leaving the service, the civilian world felt hollow, its rules arbitrary and its loyalties flimsy. He found a new purpose in the club, building it on the principles he understood: honor, discipline, and unwavering protection of the pack. The snarling wolf on his back was not a symbol of aggression, but of guardianship. A wolf protects its own, fiercely and without compromise. His vice president, seated to his right, was a man known as Deacon. Before he wore the club's patch, he was Marcus Thorne, a high-powered corporate lawyer with a corner office and a 6-figure salary. He had spent a decade defending wealthy clients from the consequences of their actions, his soul slowly eroding with every loophole he exploited. One day he'd watched a powerful executive walk away from a case where his negligence had cost a family everything. That night, Marcus had walked away from his own life. He'd traded his expensive suits for denim, and leather, his briefcase for a Harley, but he never lost his sharp legal mind. For the Iron Saints, he was their shield against the outside world, a weapon far more potent than any fist or blade. He ensured their operations were legitimate and stood ready to dismantle any legal threat that came their way. The club's sergeant-at-arms, Wrench, sat opposite them, cleaning a carburetor part with a focused intensity. His real name was Sam Jones, and he had grown up in the foster system, bounced from one indifferent house to another. He knew firsthand how easily a child could become invisible, how their voice could be silenced by the very people meant to protect them. He found his family in the grease and steel of a garage, learning to build engines from scrap. His hands, calloused and stained with oil, could fix any machine, and his heart held a quiet, fierce empathy for any soul who had ever felt lost or alone. He was the club's enforcer, but his strength was tempered by a deep well of compassion. That night, before Maya's explosive arrival, had been one of routine. They were finalizing the route for their upcoming charity ride. Wrench was arguing for a stop at a scenic overlook, while Deacon was cross-referencing road closures and permit requirements on his tablet. Stone listened, arbitrating with quiet nods and occasional grunts. The air was relaxed, the camaraderie easy and familiar. They were brothers sharing a meal and a purpose. They had built this life for themselves, a bulwark against a world they often found wanting. They didn't seek trouble, but they were bound by their code to never, ever turn away from it when it involved the helpless. This code was unspoken but universally understood. It had been forged in the collective experiences of the members. Many of them were veterans like Stone, men who had seen the fragility of life and returned with a burning need to impose order and justice on a chaotic world. Others, like Wrench, were survivors of broken homes and broken systems, who had sworn to become the protectors they themselves had never had. They had all, in their own way, been failed by the conventional structures of society. They had seen how money, status, and a polished image could be used to conceal cruelty. They trusted what they could see and touch, the loyalty in a brother's eyes, the solid steel of their bikes, the undeniable truth of a righteous cause. So when Maya stood trembling in their doorway, speaking of a locked cellar and a stolen childhood, she wasn't just speaking to a room full of bikers. She was unknowingly reciting the first verse of their sacred hymn. Her words cut through the noise and smoke, landing not on deaf ears, but on hearts primed for that exact call to action. Stone's stillness was not indecision. It was the calm of a predator that has just acquired its target. Deacon's legal mind was already spinning, calculating angles and liabilities. Wrench's hands had stilled, his knuckles white, his thoughts turning to a small, silent boy locked in the dark. For the Iron Saints, Martin Sterling's name meant nothing. His reputation was irrelevant. His status was a liability, not a shield. All that mattered were the words of the terrified young woman and the image they painted. A child in a cage. In that moment, the plans for the charity ride were forgotten. The jukebox might as well have been on another planet. The world had shrunk to a single sharp point of focus. A wrong had been identified, and the Iron Saints were about to right it. This is what they were built for. This was not an interruption of their routine. It was the fulfillment of their entire existence. The moment Maya uttered the name Martin Sterling, the atmosphere in the iron anvil shifted. It was a subtle change, not of volume, but of density. The air grew heavy, charged with a singular, unspoken purpose. Stone's eyes, which had been locked on Maya's, held her for a moment longer before he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a question. It was an acceptance. A contract had been made. "Wrench," Stone said, his voice a low rumble that commanded immediate attention. "Deacon, you're with me." He pushed his chair back, the sound of its legs scraping against the wood floor unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He stood, a mountain of a man in worn leather, and the rest of the club watched, their readiness a palpable force in the room. "The rest of you stay here," Stone commanded. "Keep the bar closed. No one in, no one out until you hear from me. Patch, you have the watch." A younger member with a prospect patch on his vest nodded sharply. "Yes, Prez." Maya watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was real. They believed her. The speed and efficiency with which they moved was both terrifying and profoundly comforting. There was no debate, no hesitation. Her desperation had found purchase. Deacon was already on his feet, slipping his phone into his pocket. His lawyer's mind was racing ahead, processing the implications. "Stone, this is delicate. We can't go in heavy. He'll use it against her, against us." "We're not going in heavy," Stone replied, his voice calm and cold as steel. "We're going to have a conversation." He turned to Maya. "Where is the house?" She gave him the address, the words tumbling out. "It's the big white one on Elm Street, at the end of the cul-de-sac. You can't miss it." "Stay here," Stone told her, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as he looked at her. "One of our guys will get you a blanket and some hot coffee. You're safe here." Maya wanted to argue, to go with them, to be there when they freed Leo, but she saw the finality in his eyes. She was a client now, under their protection, and she was being given an order. She simply nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as a different kind of tremor, one of relief, began to work its way through her. Stone, Deacon, and Wrench moved out into the storm. The rain was still coming down hard, but they seemed oblivious to it. They didn't put on helmets. They wanted their faces seen. They mounted their bikes, Stone's classic Harley-Davidson Road King, Deacon's sleek Street Glide, and Wrench's custom-built chopper, and the engines roared to life, a trio of thunderous heartbeats that ripped through the night. They pulled out of the parking lot not with a reckless burst of speed, but with a controlled, intimidating grace, their headlights cutting through the deluge. The trigger for this immediate, uncompromising action was Maya's specific, horrifying detail. It wasn't just that Leo was being punished. It was the calculated cruelty of it. He locked him in the cellar. Those words painted a picture of premeditated abuse, of a man who used fear as a tool. But it was what she said next that sealed Sterling's fate in their minds. He said he's not coming out until he can say the whole alphabet perfectly. For Stone, who had seen men break under psychological torment, this was a signature of a predator. It was about control, about breaking a person's spirit. For Wrench, who remembered being locked in a closet as a child for wetting the bed, it was a visceral, personal echo of his own past. He could feel the cold concrete floor, smell the damp, musty air. He could feel the suffocating darkness pressing in on a small boy. For Deacon, it was a crucial piece of evidence. This wasn't a simple act of discipline gone too far. It was systematic, psychological torture, a clear, definable pattern of abuse. As they rode through the rain-slicked streets, the usual sounds of the town were muted, replaced by the powerful thrum of their engines. They moved in a tight formation, a unified front of leather and steel. They passed darkened houses and sleepy storefronts, a stark, threatening presence in the quiet suburban landscape. When they turned onto Elm Street, the character of the neighborhood shifted. The houses grew larger, the lawns more expansive. It was a street that projected wealth and respectability, and there, at the end of the cul-de-sac, was Sterling's house. It was exactly as Maya had described, a large, pristine colonial with perfectly symmetrical windows and a welcoming porch light casting a warm, deceptive glow. It looked like the home of a man with nothing to hide. A car, a late-model luxury sedan, was parked in the driveway. Sterling was home. Stone killed his engine first, gliding to a silent stop directly in front of the house. Deacon and Wrench followed suit, flanking him. The sudden absence of the engine noise was more jarring than the sound itself. They sat there for a long moment, three silent, imposing figures on their machines, their presence an accusation. The house, with its warm lights, seemed to mock them. It was a fortress of lies. Stone swung his leg over his bike, his boots landing on the wet pavement with a soft thud. He didn't look back at his brothers. He didn't need to. He knew they were right behind him. The conversation was about to begin. The three men walked up the brick pathway, their heavy boots making no sound on the rain-soaked stones. They didn't stride with aggression, but with a weight and purpose that was far more intimidating. They were not here to break down the door. They were here to dismantle a man. Stone stopped before the pristine white door with its polished brass knocker. He ignored it. Instead, he raised his hand and knocked, his knuckles rapping against the solid wood with a loud, authoritative rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed in the quiet cul-de-sac, a summons that could not be ignored. Inside, Martin Sterling was sitting in his leather armchair, a book open on his lap, a glass of brandy on the table beside him. He was cultivating an image of scholarly peace, even for an audience of one. The sound of the motorcycles had been a distant annoyance, but the knock on his door was an intrusion. He frowned, placing his bookmark carefully in his novel. He assumed it was a neighbor, perhaps complaining about the noise. He opened the door with an expression of mild irritation already forming on his face. The expression froze, then melted away, replaced by a carefully blank mask of polite confusion. Standing on his porch were three of the largest, most formidable men he had ever seen. They were soaked from the rain, their leather vests adorned with the snarling wolf's head patch he recognized from town gossip. They were the Iron Saints, They just stood there, their sheer presence seeming to lower the temperature on the porch. Stone was in the center, his eyes fixed on Sterling with an unnerving stillness. "Mr. Martin Sterling?" Stone's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. Sterling's mind raced. He assessed the situation instantly. These were not men to be intimidated. They were not the police who could be managed with his reputation. This was something else entirely. He fell back on his most trusted weapon, his veneer of unimpeachable respectability. "Yes, I am," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Can I help you, gentlemen? It's quite late." He made a show of looking past them at the rain, a subtle hint that they were unwelcome. "We believe you have something that belongs to us," Stone said, his words precise and devoid of emotion. Sterling's carefully constructed composure flickered. A flash of confusion, then suspicion crossed his face. "I'm afraid I don't understand. I think you have the wrong house." He began to close the door, a gesture of polite dismissal. Wrench, who had been silent until now, took a half step forward. He didn't touch the door, but his movement was enough to halt it. "We don't have the wrong house," he said, his voice a low growl. "We're here for the boy, Leo." The name hung in the air between them. Sterling's mask became a perfect impenetrable wall. He adopted a look of deep paternal concern, mixed with a hint of sorrow. "Ah," he said, sighing dramatically. "You must have spoken with Maya. I'm so sorry you've been dragged into this. The poor girl. She's deeply troubled. She ran off a few hours ago. I was just about to call the authorities. She has these fantasies, these terrible, elaborate stories. It's a result of her trauma, you see." It was a masterclass in manipulation. In a few short sentences, he had attempted to frame Maya as a mentally unstable runaway and himself as the concerned, long-suffering guardian. He was painting a picture for them, one he was certain they would believe over the ramblings of a hysterical girl. Deacon stepped forward slightly, positioning himself beside Stone. He looked not at Sterling, but at the house behind him. "So Leo is here? He's safe?" Deacon asked, his tone deceptively casual, like a lawyer asking a seemingly innocuous question in court. "Of course he's safe," Sterling said, his voice dripping with sincerity. "He's in his room. Sleeping, I imagine. He was very upset after his sister ran out." Sterling gestured vaguely towards the upstairs. "I wouldn't want to wake him." "We'd like to see for ourselves," Stone said flatly. It wasn't a request. Sterling's smile tightened. The first cracks were appearing in his facade. "I'm sorry, but I can't allow that. You have no right to enter my home. This is a private matter. If you have concerns, you can address them with Child Protective Services in the morning. Now, I must insist that you leave my property before I am forced to call the police." He was reasserting his authority, using the language of law and order as a shield. "We know he's in the cellar, Sterling," Wrench said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. The word cellar struck Sterling like a physical blow. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the only break in his composure. It was a small visual cue, but to the three men watching him with predatory focus, it was a confession. "That's an absurd accusation," Sterling sputtered, his voice losing its smooth edge for the first time. "There's a child sleeping upstairs. His sister is a known liar who—" Stone took one step forward, closing the space between them. He was now standing in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light from inside. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "The conversation is over," Stone said, his voice low and final. "You have two options. You can open the cellar door yourself, or I will remove this door from its hinges, and then I will remove the cellar door from its hinges. Either way, we are not leaving without the boy." Sterling stared into Stone's unblinking eyes. He saw no anger, no rage, he saw something far more terrifying. Absolute certainty. He saw a man who had made a decision, a man for whom consequences were a distant and irrelevant concept. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The respectable homeowner was no longer in control. The monsters from the edge of town were in his house, and they were not there to negotiate. Sterling's carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, and all it had taken was 3 men on a porch, refusing to believe his lies. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the tense quiet. The truth was coming for him. Faced with Stone's unmovable resolve, Martin Sterling's facade finally shattered. The mask of the concerned guardian dissolved, revealing the cornered rat beneath. A flicker of pure, unadulterated fury crossed his face before being replaced by panicked calculation. He knew physical resistance was futile. His only remaining play was to control the narrative. "This is insane," he hissed, backing away from the door as Stone stepped inside, followed by Deacon and Wrench. The house, so pristine and orderly, seemed to shrink in their presence. "You're breaking and entering. I will have you all arrested." "Call them," Deacon said calmly, pulling out his phone. "In fact, I'll do it for you. I'm sure the dispatcher would be very interested to hear a recorded confession of child endangerment. Or we could just wait for them to arrive and let them listen to the boy's cries from the basement." "Your choice." Deacon's words were a legal checkmate. Sterling's threat was hollow, and he knew it. Defeated, Sterling's shoulders slumped. He shot a look of pure venom at the 3 men, before turning and walking stiffly down the polished hallway. He led them past a formal dining room and a spotless kitchen to a narrow door tucked away beside the pantry. On the door was a heavy industrial-grade slide bolt, the kind one might use on an external shed, not an interior door. Its brass was shiny and new, a stark, ugly addition to the otherwise elegant home. It was the physical proof of Maya's story. Wrench reached the door first. His face was a thundercloud of controlled rage. He looked at the bolt, then at Sterling, and his expression was so filled with contempt that Sterling physically flinched. Without waiting for Sterling to act, Wrench's large, capable hand shot out and slid the bolt back. The sound was a loud metallic clang that echoed through the silent house. It was the sound of a cage being opened. Wrench pulled the door open, revealing a steep, narrow set of wooden stairs leading down into blackness. A wave of cold, musty air washed over them, carrying the scent of damp earth and despair. From the bottom of the stairs they could hear a faint, whimpering sound. It was the sound of a small child trying to be brave in the dark. Wrench didn't hesitate. He started down the stairs, Deacon right behind him, his phone's flashlight cutting a bright, clean path through the oppressive gloom. Stone remained at the top of the stairs, his body blocking the doorway, his eyes locked on Sterling. He was the guard, ensuring the predator could not flee. The cellar was just as one might fear, cold, unfinished, with stone walls and a bare concrete floor. In the far corner, huddled against a damp wall, was a small figure. It was Leo. He was wrapped in a thin blanket, his knees drawn up to his chest. His sketchbook lay on the floor beside him. When the flashlight beam hit him, he flinched and shielded his eyes, letting out a small cry of fear. "It's okay, buddy." Wrench's voice was softer than anyone had ever heard it, the gravelly edge completely gone. "We're not gonna hurt you. We're friends of your sister, Maya." Leo peeked out from behind his hands. He saw a very large, bearded man kneeling a few feet away from him. The man wasn't moving closer. He was just waiting. Leo's eyes darted from Wrench to Deacon, who stood behind him, his presence calm and unobtrusive. "She was worried about you," Wrench continued, his voice gentle. "She sent us to come get you." Leo slowly lowered his hands. His eyes were huge in his small, pale face. tracking every micro-expression on Wrench's face. He was a child who had learned to survive by reading adults, by knowing who was safe and who was a threat. He looked at Wrench's kind eyes, at the careful way he held himself, and made a decision. He unfolded himself from his tight ball and, without a word, picked up his sketchbook. He clutched it to his chest like a shield and took a tentative step towards Wrench. Wrench didn't move. He let Leo come to him. When the boy was close enough, Wrench simply held out a hand, palm up. Leo hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed his small, cold hand into Wrench's large, warm one. It was an act of profound trust. Wrench's fingers closed gently around Leo's. "Let's get you out of here," he said softly. As they ascended the stairs, Leo holding tightly to Wrench's hand, Deacon paused. His flashlight beam had caught something on the wall near where Leo had been huddled. It was a small, black object, no bigger than a thumbnail, with a tiny, gleaming lens. A wireless camera. It was pointed directly at the spot where Sterling had left the boy. Deacon took a quick, clear photo of it with his phone, his face grim. This was no longer just about abuse. It was about something far more sinister. When they reached the top of the stairs, Leo saw Sterling standing there, held in place by Stone's powerful presence. The boy flinched and tried to hide behind Wrench's leg. Stone's eyes softened as he looked at Leo, then hardened again as he turned his gaze back to Sterling. The evidence was no longer just a story from a terrified girl. It was a trembling boy, a new bolt on a cellar door, and the chilling discovery of a hidden camera. Deacon stepped forward, his eyes cold with fury. He looked directly at Sterling. "Our turn to talk," he said. He pulled up a chair from the kitchen, placing it in the middle of the hallway. "Sit. We're going to have a formal conversation, and you're going to tell us everything." The house was no longer Sterling's sanctuary. It had become an interrogation room, and the men who society had dismissed as thugs were now the arbiters of a justice that had been, until this moment, completely blind. An institutional ally was about to be summoned. Deacon dialed a number. "Detective Harding, please. Tell her Marcus Thorne is calling regarding an active child endangerment case on Elm Street. Tell her it's urgent." The gears of systemic justice were, at last, beginning to turn. Detective Valerie Harding was a 15-year veteran of the force, a woman who had seen enough to be skeptical of everything and everyone. When the call came in from dispatch after midnight, patching her through to a man identifying himself as Marcus Thorne, her first instinct was annoyance. When he mentioned the Iron Saints, her annoyance solidified into deep suspicion. She knew the club by reputation, a pack of rough-edged bikers who kept to themselves but were always one bad night away from trouble. His claims were outlandish that they were at the home of Martin Sterling, a man Harding knew as a respected former principal and charity board member, and that they had uncovered a case of child abuse. "Mr. Thorne," she'd said, her voice crisp and professional, "are you telling me you and your associates have illegally entered Mr. Sterling's home based on an unsubstantiated claim?" "I'm telling you, Detective," Deacon's voice was unnervingly calm on the other end of the line, "that we are standing in Mr. Sterling's hallway with his 8-year-old foster son, who we just removed from a locked cellar. I'm also telling you that if you don't get a unit here in the next 10 minutes, Mr. Sterling is going to have a very serious and entirely accidental fall down those same cellar stairs. I am a licensed attorney, and I am giving you a formal notification of a crime in progress. Your response time is now on the record." The blend of legal formality and unveiled threat was enough to make Harding sit up straight. She was at her desk, catching up on paperwork, but the name Martin Sterling connected with something. She pulled up the file on Maya and Leo. She saw the notes from the social worker, Sarah Jenkins, flagging Maya's adjustment issues and accusatory fantasies. On the surface, it supported Sterling's side of the story, but Deacon's certainty was a powerful counterpoint. Harding made a decision. "I'm on my way," she said, and hung up. When Harding and her partner pulled up to the house on Elm Street, they were met with the surreal sight of two massive motorcycles parked in front of the manicured lawn, gleaming under the streetlights. The front door was open. As she approached, she saw the scene inside. Martin Sterling was sitting rigidly in a kitchen chair, his face pale and sweaty. A mountain of a man who she recognized as Stone, the club's president, stood nearby, his arms crossed, his presence a silent, immovable threat. Two other bikers were there, one comforting a small, silent boy, the other holding a phone. "Detective Harding," Deacon said, stepping forward to meet her. "Thank you for coming." Harding's eyes swept the room, taking in every detail. "All right, Thorne, talk to me. What exactly is going on here?" "My associates and I were approached by the boy's sister, Maya," Deacon began, his tone all business. "She informed us that Mr. Sterling had locked Leo in the cellar as a form of punishment. We came to verify her claim. Mr. Sterling initially denied it, but we found Leo exactly where his sister said he would be." He gestured to the narrow door with its ugly bolt. "We also found this." He showed Harding the photo on his phone of the hidden camera. Harding's professional demeanor didn't change, but her internal assessment of the situation shifted dramatically. The bolt was damning. The camera was sinister. She looked at Sterling, who avoided her gaze, staring at the floor. Then she looked at Leo, who was clutching the hand of the biker named Wrench, his eyes wide but no longer terrified. He looked safe. "Mr. Sterling," Harding said, her voice sharp, "I'm going to need you to explain this." Sterling finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "It's a misunderstanding, Detective. A complete overreaction. The boy is difficult. He doesn't speak. I was trying a new disciplinary technique, a form of timeout. The bolt is for his own safety, so he doesn't wander. Maya, his sister, is mentally unstable. She put these men up to this." "A timeout in a locked, dark cellar?" Harding asked, her voice laced with ice. "And the camera, is that also for his safety?" While Harding questioned Sterling, Deacon took Wrench and Leo into the living room, giving them space. He knelt in front of the boy. "Leo," he said gently, "my name is Deacon. Can you show me your drawings?" Leo looked at Wrench, who gave him an encouraging nod. Hesitantly, Leo opened his sketchbook. Deacon didn't try to interpret the images. He just let Leo turn the pages. The drawings were a narrative of fear. There were pictures of the house, but with bars on the windows. There was a drawing of a large, smiling man whose smile turned into a snarl on the next page. Then Leo stopped on a specific page. It was a detailed sketch of a room. It had a desk, a computer, and a chair. On the desk, next to the computer, was a small, ornate wooden box. Leo pointed to the box, then looked up at Deacon, his expression urgent. He then turned to a blank page and drew a picture of the tiny camera from the cellar, then drew an arrow from the camera to the wooden box on the desk. The connection was instant and chilling. Deacon's blood ran cold. He stood up and walked back to Detective Harding. He interrupted her questioning of Sterling. "Detective, I think you need to see this." He showed her Leo's drawing. "The boy is trying to tell us something. He's telling us where the recordings are stored." Harding looked from the drawing to Sterling. Sterling's face had gone ashen. He knew what was in that box. He jumped to his feet. "You have no right. You need a warrant to search my home." "You're right," Harding said, pulling out her handcuffs. "Martin Sterling, you are under arrest for felony child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment. We'll get that warrant, and we are going to find out exactly what you've been recording." As her partner cuffed a sputtering, indignant Sterling, Harding turned to Deacon. "Your methods are unorthodox, Mr. Thorne, but it seems your instincts are good." Deacon simply nodded. The first battle was won. Now the war for evidence had begun. While Sterling was being processed, Deacon arranged for Maya to be brought from the clubhouse. The reunion with Leo was silent but overwhelming. They just held each other, two shipwreck survivors who had finally found a life raft. The Iron Saints stood back, their presence a protective circle around them. They had placed Maya and Leo in a clean, anonymous motel, with two members standing guard outside the door around the clock. The next morning, armed with a warrant, Harding and her team went through Sterling's house with a fine-toothed comb. In the ornate wooden box on Sterling's desk, they found a hard drive. What they discovered on it was far worse than they had imagined. It contained hours of footage from the cellar camera, but also from other hidden cameras throughout the house. In Leo's bedroom, in Maya's bedroom, even in the bathroom. Sterling wasn't just a disciplinarian. He was a voyeur, a predator who fed on the fear and vulnerability of the children in his care. The recordings were cold, hard, undeniable evidence. The system, which had once protected Sterling with its assumptions and bureaucracy, was now armed with the irrefutable truth, a truth unearthed by a brave girl, a silent boy, and a brotherhood of men who refused to look away. The arrest of Martin Sterling sent a shockwave through the quiet town of Northwood. The initial news report was vague, citing only charges related to child endangerment. But in a small town, secrets have a short shelf life. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors soon gave way to horrified certainty as details began to leak. Sterling wasn't just a respected resident. He was woven into the very fabric of the community. He was on the school board, a major donor to the public library, and the beloved former principal of the elementary school that many of the town's children still attended. The community reaction was fractured and chaotic. At first, there was disbelief. Many people, particularly those who had known Sterling for years, rushed to his defense. "It has to be a mistake," said the mayor at an impromptu press conference. "Martin is a pillar of this community. We need to let the justice system do its work and not rush to judgment." Others pointed fingers not at Sterling, but at the Iron Saints. A narrative began to form among Sterling's supporters. A troubled, delinquent girl had spun a wild tale to a group of violent thugs who had then terrorized a good man. The local newspaper's online comment section became a battleground of accusations and defenses. But as more information emerged, the tide began to shift. Detective Harding, with the prosecutor's approval, released a carefully worded statement confirming that the arrest was based on significant and verifiable physical and digital evidence. The mention of digital evidence was chillingly effective. People's imaginations began to fill in the blanks. The story of Leo being found in the cellar circulated, and the image of the respected educator locking a traumatized child in the dark was too powerful to dismiss. The Iron Saints found themselves in an unfamiliar position. At the center of a public firestorm, they maintained their protective detail on Maya and Leo's motel, their bikes parked in a silent, intimidating line in the parking lot. Some residents saw them as heroes, dropping off food, coffee, and notes of thanks. Others saw them as a menace, driving by slowly and glaring, sometimes shouting insults. The bikers ignored it all. Their focus was singular, the safety of the two young people they had taken under their wing. Stone had given a clear order: no engagement. We are stone. We are a wall. Nothing gets through. The public reckoning truly began when Sarah Jenkins, the social worker, came forward. Racked with guilt, she gave a statement to Detective Harding, admitting she had dismissed Maya's earlier concerns. She then spoke to a local news reporter, her voice thick with emotion. "I failed them," she said, her interview broadcast on the evening news. "I believed the paperwork. I believed the reputation. I didn't listen to the child. Our system is designed to trust the structure, not the people it's supposed to serve. And because of that, I left those children in the hands of a monster. Sarah's public confession was a turning point. It shifted the focus from Sterling's character to the systemic failure that had enabled him. Parents who had once defended Sterling were now horrified, imagining their own children in that situation. A group of mothers organized a candlelight vigil outside the courthouse, not to condemn Sterling, but to support Maya and Leo and to demand accountability from the town's leadership and child services. The small gathering quickly grew into a rally. Hundreds of people showed up, holding signs that said, "We believe the children," and "Justice for Maya and Leo." From a distance, the Iron Saints watched the rally. They didn't join in. This was the community's fight now. Their role had been to kick down the door and sound the alarm. Now the town had to decide what to do with the truth they had exposed. The sight of neighbors and friends standing together, demanding change, was a powerful testament to the shift they had initiated. The bikers, so long on the periphery of society, had become the catalyst for its moral awakening. The most powerful public response came from an unexpected source. The teachers at the elementary school where Sterling had been principal held a press conference. One teacher, a woman in her 60s who had worked with Sterling for over 20 years, stood at the podium, her hands trembling. "We are taught to see the best in people," she said, her voice cracking. "But we are also taught to protect our students above all else. We trusted Martin. We were wrong, and our trust put children in danger. We, as educators, demand a full review of the foster placement process. We demand that the voices of children are prioritized over the reputations of adults." The public reckoning was no longer just about one man's crimes. It had become a referendum on the town's values. People were forced to ask themselves uncomfortable questions. How had they allowed this to happen? Who else was hiding behind a mask of respectability? The Iron Saints, once symbols of fear on the edge of town, were now seen by a growing majority as what they truly were: uncompromising protectors who saw a truth that everyone else had been too complacent to notice. Their leather vests and roaring engines, once perceived as a threat, had become, for many, a symbol of righteous intervention in a world that too often looks away. The town of Northwood was being forced to look at itself in the mirror, and it did not like what it saw. The trial of Martin Sterling was a somber affair that held the town of Northwood in a state of suspended animation. The courtroom was packed every day, a silent audience of townspeople, teachers, and parents, bearing witness to the dismantling of a man they thought they knew. Sterling, dressed in a tailored suit, looked diminished, his confident air replaced by a sullen, resentful pallor. His high-priced defense attorney attempted to paint the entire affair as a grand conspiracy, a narrative of a troubled, manipulative girl and a band of brutish bikers who had coerced a confession and planted evidence. But the prosecution, led by a steely-eyed district attorney named Maria Flores, had a mountain of irrefutable proof, meticulously organized and presented by Deacon, who was working with her team pro bono. The first blow to the defense was the bolt on the cellar door, brought into the courtroom and mounted on a board for the jury to see. Its stark industrial ugliness was a potent symbol of Sterling's cruelty. Next came the testimony of Detective Harding, who detailed the discovery of Leo in the cellar and the subsequent uncovering of the hidden cameras. She was a calm, credible witness, her testimony unshakable under cross-examination. The digital evidence was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. They played a short, carefully selected clip from the hard drive, a video from the cellar, dark and grainy. There was no sound, but the image was harrowing. It showed Leo, small and alone, rocking back and forth in the corner. The jury watched in stunned silence. One juror, a middle-aged father, wiped a tear from his eye. The footage from the other rooms was not shown to the jury, deemed too prejudicial and invasive, but the mere fact of its existence, described in detail by a forensic expert, painted a complete picture of Sterling's depravity. The emotional climax of the trial came with Maya's testimony. Dressed in a simple blue dress, she took the stand, her voice quiet but steady. Deacon had spent weeks preparing her, not coaching her on what to say, but simply reassuring her that telling her truth was enough. With Flores guiding her with gentle questions, Maya recounted the months in Sterling's house, the escalating rules, the isolation, the constant feeling of being watched. She described the night she ran, her voice breaking only once when she spoke of hearing Leo's sobs through the cellar door. Sterling's lawyer was brutal in his cross-examination. He attacked her credibility, bringing up the social worker's initial notes about her fantasies. He tried to twist her love for her brother into a sign of over-possessiveness, her fear into hysteria. "Isn't it true, Ms. Sanchez," he sneered, "that you resented Mr. Sterling for trying to bring order to your chaotic lives? That you concocted this story to get away from a man who was simply trying to be a father to you?" Maya looked not at the lawyer, but directly at the jury. "He was not a father," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the courtroom. "He was a cage builder. I didn't run away from order. I ran to save my brother's life." The final piece of the puzzle was Leo. He was deemed too young and fragile to testify in open court. Instead, a closed-circuit feed was set up from a quiet room where he sat with a child psychologist. The only other people in the room were Deacon and Wrench, who sat in a corner, their silent presence a source of strength for the boy. Leo didn't speak. He didn't have to. The psychologist asked him to show the judge his drawings. On the large screen in the courtroom, Leo's sketchbook appeared. He turned the pages, showing the jury his world. The house with bars, the man with the snarling face, the door with the heavy lock. Then he turned to a new page. It was a drawing he had made the day before. It showed the cellar, dark and scary, but this time there were 3 figures at the top of the stairs. They were big, and they wore vests with wolves on the back. They were shining a light into the darkness. The psychologist asked, "Leo, who are those men?" Leo didn't speak, but he pointed to the figures, then gave the camera a small, hopeful smile. It was the most powerful testimony of the entire trial. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The foreman, the same man who had wept during the video, stood and read the verdict, his voice firm. "On the charge of felony child endangerment, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. On the charge of unlawful imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty. On multiple counts of invasion of privacy, we find the defendant guilty." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Martin Sterling sat down heavily, his face slack with disbelief. Justice, which had for so long been blind to his crimes, had finally been delivered. Maya, sitting between Deacon and Sarah Jenkins, began to sob, not from fear or sorrow, but from the overwhelming weight of relief. Across the room, Stone, who had attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row, gave a single slow nod. The system, forced into action, had worked. The promise made to a terrified girl in a biker bar on a rainy night had been kept. Sterling was led away in handcuffs, no longer a pillar of the community, but a convicted felon, his reputation shattered, his legacy one of shame. The conviction of Martin Sterling was not an end, but a beginning. The trial had exposed not just the darkness in one man, but the cracks in the very systems designed to protect the innocent. The town of Northwood, shaken from its complacency, was now faced with the monumental task of rebuilding trust and ensuring such a failure could never happen again. The ripples of that courtroom verdict spread far and wide, creating a legacy of meaningful reform. Led by a coalition of the teachers who had spoken out and the parents who had rallied, a Citizens Oversight Committee for Child and Family Services was formed. Their first act was to lobby the state legislature, using the high-profile nature of Sterling's case as leverage. Within a year, Leo's law was passed. It was a sweeping piece of legislation that mandated more rigorous, unannounced spot checks on foster homes, required that children's testimony be given greater weight during investigations, and funded a new statewide program for independent child advocates, lawyers and social workers whose sole responsibility was to represent the child's interests, separate from the state's. Sarah Jenkins, who had resigned from her position, was one of the first to be hired by this new advocacy group, her past failure now fueling a tireless dedication to being the voice she wished she had been for Maya and Leo. At the local level, the changes were just as profound. The Northwood Police Department, at Detective Harding's urging, established a new Special Victims Unit dedicated to crimes against children. Harding, now a lieutenant, handpicked and trained her team, emphasizing the importance of believing initial reports and investigating reputations, not just criminal records. Her first official training seminar for new recruits included a case study of the Sterling investigation, highlighting the critical role of unconventional allies and the importance of listening to the quietest voices. The Iron Saints' role in the community underwent a seismic transformation. They were no longer the shadowy figures on the edge of town. They were guardians. The annual toy run they had always held saw triple the participation, with townspeople and local businesses donating in droves. But their most significant contribution was the establishment of the Iron Anvil Foundation. With Deacon managing the legalities and Wrench overseeing logistics, they converted a portion of their clubhouse property into a secure, temporary safe house for children and teens removed from dangerous situations, a place to stay in the critical hours before social services could arrange a verified placement. It was a way to bridge the gap, to ensure no child would have to wait in fear. They funded it themselves through charity rides and fundraisers that the entire town now supported. The snarling wolf on their vests took on a new meaning for the people of Northwood. It was the symbol of an unbreakable promise. Maya and Leo, the catalysts for all this change, began the slow, arduous process of healing. With the financial support from a victims' compensation fund that Deacon had secured for them and the emotional support of their new, unconventional family, they started to build a new life. Maya, who had put her own future on hold, enrolled in community college, studying to become a social worker. She wanted to be the person she and Leo had so desperately needed. Her nights were no longer filled with fear, but with textbooks and lectures, her mind focused on a future where she could help others. Leo's transformation was quieter but no less remarkable. He continued to live with Maya in a small, clean apartment they had rented, a space that was truly their own. He slowly began to speak again. It started with single words, whispered to Maya or Wrench. "Okay, thanks. Home." Wrench, who visited them regularly, never pushed. He'd just sit with Leo, helping him with a model airplane or looking through his sketchbook. One afternoon, as they were working, Leo looked up at Wrench and said, "Clear as a bell, you fixed it," referring to a broken wing on the model. Wrench just smiled. "Yeah, buddy, we did." The silence that had been his prison for so long was finally receding. His drawings changed, too. The dark lines and cages were replaced by color. He drew pictures of the Iron Saints' bikes, of the sun, of him and Maya, holding hands, their faces now filled in with bright, happy smiles. The legacy of Sterling's cruelty was not a legacy of brokenness, but one of resilience, reform, and a community that had learned, the hard way, to pay attention. The autumn air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the faint, sweet smell of apple cider. At the Iron Saints clubhouse, the atmosphere was one of quiet celebration. It wasn't a wild party, but a family barbecue. The long tables were laden with food, and the sound of laughter mixed with the classic rock playing softly from the speakers. This was the new normal. The club was no longer an isolated fortress, but the heart of a sprawling, chosen family. Leo, now 9.5, was in the middle of it all. He was no longer a silent, haunted ghost. He was a boy full of life and mischief. He darted across the lawn, engaged in a mock sword fight with Wrench, both of them armed with foam noodles. Leo's laughter was loud and unrestrained, a sound that made every member of the club smile. He had found his voice, and he used it with the joyous abandon of a child who knows he is safe. Maya sat at a table with Deacon and Detective Harding, who had become a regular visitor. A textbook lay open in front of Maya, but she was mostly just watching her brother play, a gentle, peaceful smile on her face. She had just received her grades from her first semester at college, straight A's. In her bag was a letter of acceptance into the university's social work program. Her future, which had once been a terrifying blank void, was now a clear and promising path. Stone walked over and sat down beside her. He placed a small, worn wooden box on the table. It wasn't the ornate, sinister box from Sterling's desk, but an old, handcrafted one. "For you," he said, his voice a low rumble. Maya opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of red velvet, was a set of car keys. "It's not new," Stone said, almost apologetically. "Wrench and the boys rebuilt the engine. It's a '98 Civic, but it's reliable. It'll get you to class and back. No more taking the bus." Tears welled in Maya's eyes. It wasn't just a car. It was freedom. It was stability. It was a tangible symbol of the care and protection these men had wrapped around her and her brother. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice thick, "for any of this." "You don't have to," Stone said, his gaze shifting to Leo, who had just managed to bonk Wrench on the head with his noodle, eliciting a playful roar. "Watching him laugh, that's all the thanks we'll ever need. You showed us something, kid. You reminded us what we're for." Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Leo came running up to Maya, his sketchbook in his hands. "I made something," he said, his voice bright. He opened it to the last page. It was a drawing full of vibrant color. In the center were two figures, a tall girl with dark hair and a smaller boy holding hands. They were surrounded by a large group of big, bearded men in leather vests, all of them smiling. Above them, a bright yellow sun shone down, and in the sky he had drawn a dozen motorcycles, flying like guardian angels. At the bottom, in careful, slightly wobbly letters, he had written, "My family." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She carefully tore the page from the sketchbook and walked over to the large corkboard inside the clubhouse, the one covered in club announcements and photographs. She found an empty space and pinned the drawing right in the center. It was a testament, a declaration, a new chapter in the history of the Iron Saints. As dusk settled into night, the brothers began to mount their bikes. It was time for their evening ride, a ritual as old as the club itself. The engines roared to life, a familiar chorus of controlled power. Maya and Leo stood on the porch, watching them. Stone, sitting on his Road King, caught Maya's eye and gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was the same nod he had given her on that first, terrifying night. But now it held a different meaning. It wasn't a promise to act, it was a promise kept. They rode off in formation, their tail lights a string of red jewels disappearing down the dark highway. They were not riding away from anything, but towards the horizon, forever on patrol. The world was a little safer, a little brighter, because one night when a child's plea for help went unheard by everyone else, they had been there to listen, and they had answered the call. Maya put her arm around Leo's shoulders, pulling him close as they watched the last light fade. They were home. They were safe. and in the quiet of the night they could still hear the distant, reassuring rumble of their guardians on the road.